Whether you call it a deload week, a recovery week, adaptation phase, whatever it might be, making sure you get this right is really, really critical to then getting into the next block of training and avoiding the worst case scenario in terms of performance, which is going through a phase of ultimately detraining yourself, reducing yourself back down. The point of these weeks is to boost everything up. So without any further ado, let's get into the biggest mistakes I see and talk about with athletes and coaches in regards to planning these deload weeks and what you should be doing to making sure you're getting the most out of them and you are seeing improvement as a result of these and not going backwards in the process. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sports science simple. And in this video, we're talking all about our deload, recovery, adaptation week, whatever you want to call it. And in terms of this week, it follows very, very similar principles to how we should treat our taper. I'm going to get more into the nitty gritty of what we should be doing. But first and foremost, let's cover off a couple of the mistakes and really the big mistakes that athletes and coaches and people I talk to in the industry make when it comes to these weeks. So ultimately, when we are talking about a recovery week, a deload, maybe an adaptation phase, all of these, the point of it across most definitions is going to be allowing the body to take some time, repair, rest, and ultimately see those adaptations come through. So we've gone through potentially, let's say for example, a big base phase. We're trying to develop our aerobic system. We're trying to see some of that mitochondrial change, see that really good cardiovascular improvement, heart rate dropping for the same output in terms of pace or power. All of these things we want to see come to the fore, but those are only going to come to, be after a bit of recovery and time to be able to have the body repair and go through that super compensation or bounce back out of that performance slump because we're not fatigued anymore, we're fresh, ready to go, and we can see that our body's rebounded back to a higher point because it wants to be prepared for that next bout of training that we're going through. That's a really simple way adaptation works. But the big mistakes people make in these blocks is, first and foremost, they might just go and stop training. So thinking that I need to do recovery, so I'm going to back everything off and I'm just going to flat out stop training because that's going to give me the rest and recovery I need. Firstly, it's not a great way to go about it. It's the easiest way to detrain yourself is by not doing anything. This probably doesn't happen more on those regular deloads. So if you're a person who might do a couple of weeks building and then a deload week, that's a pretty typical way to periodize or strategically plan your training. And that's a good way to go about it. We need interspersed recovery all along. This probably happens more so if you've got a race that got cancelled, for example, which I've spoken to athletes about very recently in the last couple of weeks. Or maybe you're coming into an off season and then you're going to reset yourself and you want to go through a phase of just keeping things a little bit lower so your body can have that time to fully repair and recover. Maybe you've led up to an Ironman or a big season's worth of training and competing. You just want to have some time off. Stopping training completely is the easiest way to lose as much fitness as possible. So that's the obvious one. By doing something, you're gonna maintain a little bit of your fitness in there much better than not doing anything at all. The second big mistake is looking at things in a very backwards way. Reducing the intensity and maintaining the volume basically is the really complete opposite of what we want to try and achieve. I can understand the thought process of why you would want to go through that. Reducing the intensity, they're my hard sessions, so to speak. So I'm going to reduce how much of that I'm doing. I'm just going to keep doing the easy stuff. Low RPE, I can go out, I can feel like I can get the sessions done. But at the end of the day, the biggest fatiguing thing in our week is the sessions or the areas of our week that have the highest total training load. And the training load is made up of a combination of the intensity and duration. So if we're talking about 2 1-hour sessions, one of them is at a high intensity and one of them is at a low intensity, well, obviously the low intensity session has a lower training load because we've got the same duration, the intensity is going to dictate it. That works only when you have very, very similar length sessions. Where it gets more complicated is you might have a short and sharp 20, 30 minute little high intensity interval training session that you're going to do as a bit of a maintenance type thing or just to keep things ticking along, but it's really short in duration. Yes, the intensity is up, so our total training load might not actually be that high compared to a 2-hour long, slow, easy run, for example, or easy session where the training load might actually be a lot higher than what we thought. Yes, the intensity's down, but the volume is so much higher. So this is where you have to be mindful that those things don't necessarily, just because it's high intensity doesn't necessarily mean it's the most fatiguing in the week. Typically our big volume, and particularly for a lot of endurance athletes, is the big volume is going to be the most fatiguing part of the week. Ultimately, what we want to do to rectify this, well, we want to try and do basically the exact opposite. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit more detail. But really, that's the easiest way a lot of people lose fitness in things like a taper as well, leading into a race and why you might feel flat. or leading into an event, why you might not feel sort of sharp and ready to go and have that springiness in your step, if you like, is because we're reducing some of the intensity. That intensity is really, really critical for just maintaining, I guess, how active our physiological adaptations are. How active are those processes we've spent all this time to work on and develop? How are things ticking along? And a great example I had in the lab the other day was talking to an athlete through this exact process, had their race cancelled last minute, they're working towards another block, they thought they'd take a bit of time off, and ultimately they started to reduce some of their high intensity to the point that when we retested them in their lab, their VO2 max power had dropped by about 30 watts. FTP and things like that might have stayed the same, which is a bit lucky, but fundamentally the top end of their engine is a lot smaller, so they couldn't push as hard as they liked at the top end. It's going to mean we're going to have to go and do a significant chunk of training to be able to get them back up to where they were before they can get ready into that next block. Ultimately, the race isn't too far away. It was only about sort of 8 or 9 weeks from when we had the chat. So what does that mean? Well, it means that potentially this new race date, they're not going to be able to perform as well as they could because they've just detrained themselves compared to what they tried to build over the previous 6 months, really. So it's really critical to keep some of the intensity in there. And ultimately, the best way to go about it when we are in these recovery weeks, adaptation phases, and even your taper is to follow the principle of maintain the intensity. I can't stress that enough. Keep the intensity up, but think about reducing the volume. And what I mean by that is you're not going out and still having to do a big high intensity interval set. You don't have to go and do 20, 30, 40 minutes of working time. You might only do 8 minutes of working time. So if you're doing maybe VO2 style intervals, 2 minute on, equal work to rest, that type of thing, you might only do, say, if it's 2 minute on, 2 minute off, you might only do 6 or maybe even 5 2-minute efforts. There's sort of 10 minutes of working time. It's not a massive amount compared to when you would normally go through a big hard block of that type of training. Maybe you're doing 8 or 10 of those intervals instead. We're reducing the number of efforts basically in those high intensity sessions, but it's important to keep the intensity up there as we would normally. That's going to keep all of our physiological processes ticking along. Similarly, on the other side, we want to actually reduce the volume. And as I just said, dropping it in the high intensity sessions, not doing as many efforts is an easy one there. But then in your longer, slower, more continuous based sessions, maybe your easy runs or your easy rides, you need to drop the volume there, because if we're doing 3 hours, that might still have a really high training load at the end of the day. So we're still going to be receiving a reasonable amount of fatigue. We're not going to get that recovery effect. So dropping back how much we're doing, again, maintain the intensity. It still can be easy. You don't have to do anything different there. It's just we don't need to go out and do a 3-hour ride in our deload week. Maybe we only need to do an hour and a half or maybe a 2-hour ride, for example, depending on how much recovery we need. It's very different. It's very individualized on how much we might drop that back or how little we might drop it, because we're trying to go for a bit more of an aggressive training stimulus at the end of the day. But fundamentally, following that principle of maintain intensity and reducing volume is the best way to make sure that you're not going to lose anything. At the end of the day, we don't want this recovery week to be a detraining week. We want it to be more of a recovery adaptation and allow us to springboard into the next block, or ultimately, if this is falling in where your taper is, be able to perform on the event day or race day. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight in terms of the better way you can go about these recovery and adaptation weeks, or deload weeks if you like. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you normally do when you get to a deload week? What is your first thing that you do with your program? What do you change up? How do you reduce things? Have you been reducing the volume and maintaining the intensity, or have you been doing it the other way and seeing some of these negative responses that we're talking about? Always happy to hear it in your thoughts down below in the comments, so let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. That is it for today, and we'll see you in the next one.